You're about to hear an incredible interview from Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. But first, this segment is sponsored by Continental Gold, which has one of the highest grade gold deposits in the entire world. Britick has gold resources of over 7 million ounces of gold, averaging nearly 10 grams per ton of gold. The company also has other high-grade exploration projects, and all projects are 100% owned. Continental has roughly $70 million of cash in the bank, and management owns 16% of the company. Continental Gold, symbol CNL in Canada, and CGOOF in the U.S. This is King World News. I'm Eric King. Remember to go to our homepage, where on Sunday we will have a special release with Egon von Greyerz, and what an incredible interview he gave. And where earlier in the week we had Dr. Stephen Lieb and Andrew McGuire. But without any further delay, here is Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. Joining us now is Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. He is the former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, and he is also the former Associate Editor and columnist with the Wall Street Journal. Dr. Roberts, what kind of world is this going to be in the future? What are we looking at here?
Well, I'm not a seer, Eric, but clearly a large part of the world, half of it or more, is in the process of trying to reorient itself away from the West, away from Western, which means, of course, Washington-dominated financial institutions, not just the huge private banks that are too big to fail, and Wall Street and the hedge funds, but also the IMF, the World Bank, the SWIFT clearing mechanism. All of these Western financial institutions are now recognized by the governments in Russia and India and China and South Africa and South America and much of Asia to be exploitative institutions that loot other countries. And they're being given a great demonstration of that right now by Washington with the sanctions on Iran and Russia now, and the manipulation of the Russian currency. So the rest of the world, the non-Western world, sees that they have, if they're going to be sovereign, independent countries and not vassal states of the West, that they have to have their own economic institutions, and they are in the process of withdrawing from the Western ones. We've seen this with the BRICS formation of new IMF, World Bank institution. We see it in the deals that Russia and China are making, that Russia and Turkey are making, that Russia and India are making, in which the trade is not conducted in dollars. And we see it in the Russian announcement that they're ceasing to sell energy for dollars. You'll have to pay in gold or rubles or some other currency. So, and we see it in Russia setting up their own clearing mechanism system to take the place of the SWIFT system. And I'm confident that these countries will be able to pull this off because they're large, and the Russian economy is full of valuable resources, and the Chinese economy has every kind of manufacturing capability and technology. Indeed, now they surpass our own. So they will succeed, and it's going to leave the West as a rump state. There'll be the United States and its puppets in Europe, Canada, Australia, Japan, and, of course, Mexico. And so that will be the Western world, and it will be essentially cut off from the massive economic activity that will be unleashed in the rest of the world. So, and this is something that Washington brought on itself. And no one's aware of this. If you listen to all the news, for example, I was listening today to National Public Radio, and there were all these self-righteous people just happy as all get out that they'd finally stomped Russia into the ground, and Russia now is finished, and Russia was broken, and would soon be an American vassal state where it belongs. And I was listening to this, Rod, and I got to thinking, how can people be so utterly stupid? But they are. And they're just as stupid in Washington. So that is what we're going to see happen. And in the meantime, and as part of this process, Eric, we may see the Russians unleash the predicted black swans that brings down the Western house of cards. Suppose the Russian government says, well, since the attack on the ruble is political, and you guys are attacking the ruble and caused us so much trouble, whether they have or not, they can say they've caused trouble. We're just going to not pay off the next tranche of our debt that comes due early in 2015. Well, what would happen? Most likely, the European banking system would collapse because those banks are terribly undercapitalized. Some of them have loans to Russia that almost absorb the entire capital base. So all the Russians have to do is they don't even have to default. They can just say, well, we're not going to pay this year. We'll do it later. We'll do it when the ruble stabilizes. You can understand the impact of such a decision by the Russians on the West. And given all the linkages and the interconnections, when Lehman Brothers went down, I think it had just about as much adverse effect on Europe as it did the United States. So if the Russians want to simply say, we're not going to pay, or at least not now, and leave the banks hanging, what exactly comes out of that?
Dr. Roberts, you mentioned there were multiple black swans Russia could unleash to bring down the West. You mentioned one there. Are there some others?
Yes, there are others. One, of course, would be to buy up all of the naked shorts that the bullion banks dump into the COMEX market every time they drive down the gold and silver price. The Russians could just buy them up, and then instead of settling in cash, which is how the COMEX usually settles, you have the right to settle in gold. And so they could just buy up all these tons and tons and tons of contracts, or contracts representing tons and tons of gold, and say, okay, we want the gold. Well, where would it come from? Or it certainly would cause turmoil. And once turmoil is started, Eric, you don't know what the effect of it can be. All sorts of black swans can come out of just one. See, one act of turmoil. What is the consequence? Another thing, in fact, it could be something they actually have in mind. Just let the ruble fall as it goes down and down and down. The Russians have a very large stock of dollars, as do the Chinese, of course. Then they can buy up the rubles at a very cheap price and withdraw them from the Western markets so that there's no longer any vulnerability. Well, this would cause tremendous consternation. If the Russians say we won't sell our energy except in rubles, and the Russians have withdrawn all the rubles from the market, how is anybody going to get the rubles? Then it depends on the price the Russians ask for it. So you see, there's an endless number of these things they could do. I myself think that Putin is unlikely to do that, but if the Americans continue to push, something like this may happen. And so if they simply didn't pay off the loans that are coming due, probably the European banking system would collapse. And what would come from that? Well, who knows? There's all kinds of derivatives and credit default swaps everywhere. We know these derivatives now are some multiple of the world's gross domestic product. And nobody really knows who all the counterparties are, what all the interrelations are. If the European banks start going down, who knows what the impact in this pile of derivatives would be. But the whole Western system is a house of cards. It's not based on anything other than market manipulation. So it doesn't take much of a push to knock it down.
Let's talk a minute about this idea, though, of the collapse of the Western banking system, because they're putting into place all kinds of measures to utilize bail-ins. And I'm just wondering, obviously they can see the vulnerability in the West, and I guess the idea is to loot the individual savings of people as the banking system comes crashing down.
That seems to be the idea, but of course it makes no sense. What good is a population to a country that's dispossessed and has nothing? If you loot their bank deposits, which is what bail-ins can do, they could do that. We saw some sign of that in Cyprus a while back when there was the bank problem there. But if you loot everybody's savings, how do they sustain themselves? How do they purchase the goods that the corporations make or the services? How do they buy groceries, gasoline? So it takes a very short-sighted form of greed for a government or a corporate system to want to loot its own customers, the people that keep it alive with their purchases. So it's kind of hard to see how these people think. It doesn't really make a lot of sense any more than picking on Russia makes any sense. So again, what kind of black swan would come out of that? The bank fails and they say, well, it's not our fault, it's the depositor's fault, so give us your money. Well, what happens? People lose their checking accounts, their savings accounts. What happens next? How does anybody buy anything? How does the payment system work? Nobody would put any money in a bank again after that. So how would you even make payments? So the whole thing is fraught with risk, and it's in the hands of very stupid and arrogant people in Washington.
Dr. Roberts, what's the biggest black swan Russia could unleash as you see it?
The biggest black swan of all, Eric, is if the Russians get thoroughly angry. All they got to do is call up the European governments and say, we no longer sell natural gas or any form of energy to members of NATO. The consequence would be the utter total collapse of NATO. Not even a puppet state like Germany is going to let the people freeze to death, let the factories be closed down, let the unemployment rate hit 40%. It's just not going to happen. It would be the end of NATO. So whenever the Russians want to destroy NATO, that's all they got to do. Just call up the puppet Merkel, the puppet Hollande, the puppet Cameron, and say, you guys really enjoy being in NATO? Well, let me tell you what. We no longer sell energy to NATO members. That's the end of NATO. That's the end of the cover for American power. Most likely, that would set off so many black swans. Every banking system would probably collapse because if the German banks are faced with German industry closing down, what the hell is going to happen to the banks? So all the cards are in Putin's hand. None of them are in Washington's hand. And the difference is that Putin is just going to ignore it and go ahead and reorient Russia toward the east. And you're going to see Russia and India and China take over the leadership of the world. That'll start in 2015.
Dr. Roberts, for 2015, what are your predictions? What surprises are in front of us next year?
Well, at any time, the Western House of Cards could collapse. It's a house of cards. There are no economic fundamentals that support the stock prices, the Dow Jones. There are no economic fundamentals that support the strong dollar. To have a bond market in which the purchases of bonds have to pay a fee in order to have a negative interest rate, a negative real interest rate, makes no sense. When you buy a bond, you're automatically getting back less than you paid for it because, first of all, you got to buy a premium. You have to pay a premium to get the bond, a premium over its face value to get the bond, and the interest rate you get is less than the inflation rate. So what sense does that make when the United States debt is exploding, when the money supply is exploding? It makes no sense at all. So not any American markets make any sense. They're rigged. I think it will be the world will start to see the realignment of power as it drifts away from the West toward Russia, China, India, the BRICS, and the states that ally with them, such as South American countries who are tired of American imperialism, South Africa. You'll see a shift in the balance of power that will be unfavorable to Washington.
Dr. Roberts, is 2015 the year that the gold price manipulation will end?
I don't know. I think what will end it will be when the West runs out of gold to deliver. Because when the bullion banks or the Federal Reserve artificially suppress the price of gold, it causes a greater quantity demanded. And so you see that as they push down the gold price, the demand for the gold in China and India and Russia goes up. So at what point will they be unable to make delivery? And when that point rises, that's when the gold will break loose. When the day the Asian demand for gold at the artificially fixed low price, the day that demand exceeds the ability of the West to supply the gold, the price rigging system falls apart. And at that point, gold can move instantly very high. Now, I don't know what the ability of the West to continue making deliveries is. I don't know what aspects of production, annual production, is controlled by the West. Clearly, the price of gold being suppresses the ability to produce more gold. The mines, they can produce more gold, the higher the price. The lower the price, the less they can produce because of the cost of production. It varies. So when Washington suppresses the price of gold, they drive supply down. The mining companies cut back, or else they hoard the ore waiting for a higher price. Yet the demand for the gold goes up. So when you have the demand high and the supply restrained, you're basically operating on stocks. And what are those stocks, and how extensive are they? There's been a lot of speculation that the Fed used up the Fort Knox gold a long time ago. And more speculation, they've even used up the other countries' gold that was deposited with them for safekeeping, such as Germany's gold. They can't give Germany's gold back. Why? Well, the speculation is they've used it up. So if there's no stocks to fill the gap between falling production because of a low price and rising demand because of a low price, then at some point the system simply can't meet delivery. And when that happens is when it falls apart.
Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury and former Associate Editor and columnist with the Wall Street Journal. Thank you for joining us on King World News.
Pleased to speak with you, Eric.
Be sure to tune in on Sundays. KWN has a special release with Egon von Greyerz, and what an incredible interview he gave. And be sure to tune in each day as we will continue to release interviews with the top people in the world throughout the week. Also, make sure to check out the King World News blog.